Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, I want to take you to London, the winter of 1895. A season so bitter that people swore the very air could cut through bone. This wasn't just a cold spell. It was one of the harshest freezes the city had ever endured. And for those who already lived on the edge of poverty, it became a daily fight for survival. If this story draws you in, don't forget to leave a like and hit follow. It keeps these journeys alive and lets me bring you more. Now, imagine the city at dawn. The Thames lay muted beneath sheets of ice, barges locked in place, their crews huddled around weak fires as smoke curled faintly into the mist. Streets that usually pulsed with movement were hushed, cobblestones glazed with frost, gas lamps glowing like halos in the fog. Even the sound of hoofbeats seemed softened, as though London itself was holding its breath. For the wealthy, there were heavy curtains, thick carpets, roaring fireplaces. For the poor, there were drafty tenements, thin blankets and fires that sputtered from a single ember. Families clung together in cramped rooms, layering coats over rags, listening to the wind whistle through cracks in the brick. Coal was treasure, firewood a prize worth hours of searching. Children trailed behind coal carts, snatching fallen lumps before the driver's whips could reach them. Every scrap mattered. One piece of fuel could mean a night without frostbite. Inside, the hearth was the soul of the home, no matter how small or weak the flame. Mothers blew gently on embers, teaching children to nurse fire the way others might teach arithmetic. Around that glow, people warmed stiff fingers, dried soaked clothes, and tried to coax thin broth into something resembling a meal. It wasn't just heat. It was hope flickering in orange light, reminding them that even in the bleakest hours, warmth still existed. Markets struggled on, though they looked more like frozen museums than places of trade. Vegetables shriveled under frost. Fish lay stiff as boards, eyes glazed in ice. Meat was scarce, guarded carefully behind counters. Mothers bargained desperately for bones, anything that could flavor water into soup. Children hung back, hoping for a bruised apple or a crust too small to sell. And yet, amid the grim hunger, kindness surfaced. A baker slipped a misshapen roll to a shivering child. A flower girl handed a fading bloom to an old woman with nothing in her purse. These moments didn't erase the hardship, but they softened its edges. Hunger gnawed as constantly as the cold. Parents skipped meals so their children could eat. Neighbors traded scraps like currency, a slice of bread for a handful of coal, a bundle of sticks for a cup of broth. Survival was a network of quiet sacrifices. And illness lurked everywhere, spread easily in damp, crowded rooms. Coughs rattled through walls, fevers burned behind tired eyes, and hospitals overflowed. Families turned to remedies as old as memory: mustard plasters, onion soup, vinegar rubs, more ritual than cure. But each gesture was a way of saying, "We won't give up." Yet through all of this, life did not vanish. Children turned snow into play, sliding across frozen alleys, laughter ringing sharp against the silence. Neighbors carried embers from one hearth to another, a literal sharing of warmth. Even the smallest acts became rebellion against despair. In the frost-bitten streets, humanity revealed itself not in grand gestures, but in the way people refused to stop caring. And every morning, the city stirred again. Chimneys coughed smoke into gray skies. Footsteps echoed on icy stone. London, scarred and shivering, still breathed. For the poor, making it through another night wasn't just survival. It was proof of resilience, of stubborn strength, of the quiet courage that history too often overlooks. That was London in the winter of 1895. A frozen city, a city of hunger and hardship, but also a city where even the smallest flame, the faintest laugh, the tiniest act of kindness, carried the power to keep people alive. The morning after a night like that, London didn't wake up so much as it staggered back into motion. Pale light leaked through heavy fog, silvering rooftops, and turning icicles into jagged glass teeth that hung from gutters. The cold wasn't just outside, it lived inside people's bones. Men stretched their hands and winced, as if their joints had rusted overnight. Children rubbed their feet, red and cracked, from sleeping too close to frozen floors. Fuel was the obsession of every household. Without it, no meal could be cooked, no fire coaxed to life, no body shielded from the creeping frost. Coal was scarce, its price inflated beyond reach for many. Families queued at yards for hours, coins clutched in raw hands, hoping to secure even a small sack. Those who couldn't afford it scoured alleys for driftwood, broken crates, splinters from discarded furniture. Children learned early which wood sparked quick and which burned longer, their survival knowledge passed down like secrets. The streets echoed with this scavenging. You could see men balancing heavy bundles of sticks across their shoulders, boots sliding on the icy stones. Women carried baskets lined with scraps, every twig guarded as though it were gold. Even children carried chipped buckets filled with kindling, staggering under the weight, faces pale but determined. And sometimes, in a cruel twist, those small treasures were stolen on the way home, snatched by desperate hands lurking in the fog. Inside the tenements, fires were a ceremony. The smallest ember was coaxed like an infant. Mothers leaned close, shielding the weak flame with their bodies, whispering to children to blow gently, not too hard, just enough to bring the orange glow alive. When the fire finally caught, relief spread through the room like sunlight, even if the warmth barely stretched beyond a few feet. Families huddled tight, hands outstretched, backs pressed together. Every pop of wood, every hiss of coal was a victory. But warmth never lasted long. Rooms were drafty, the wind slipping through cracks in bricks and rattling broken shutters. Blankets were layered over windows, coats stuffed into door frames, but the cold still pushed in, stubborn and merciless. At night, people curled under piles of rags and quilts, teeth chattering in unison, listening to the whistle of the wind and the groan of the building. Some nights, water buckets froze solid indoors. Washing was abandoned. To undress was to step into knives. And yet, amid this misery, tenderness thrived. Mothers saved the last slice of bread for their children, pretending they weren't hungry. Fathers returned from the docks with nothing but empty hands and still found the courage to smile, to tell a story, to make the cold seem less cruel for an hour. Neighbors carried glowing embers in small tins across icy courtyards, offering one another the possibility of a fire. It was survival, yes, but also a quiet kind of grace. The hunger was sharp, relentless. Meals were thin, often little more than watered-down broth or a crust softened in weak tea. Markets displayed frost-bitten vegetables, stiff fish, stale loaves. Meat was a luxury out of reach for most. But ingenuity kept people going. Broth was stretched with water, bones boiled until nothing remained. Roots and scraps turned into meals that fed more souls than they should have. Families traded what little they had: a slice of bread for a handful of coal, a bundle of twigs for a spoonful of soup, and through all this, children found ways to laugh. They slid on frozen mud, turned snow into battles, built makeshift sleds out of broken crates. Their mittens were thin, their shoes full of holes, but their joy rang out like defiance against the season. Their laughter carried down alleys, echoing against brick walls, reminding everyone that winter hadn't won entirely. By evening, the city looked like a dream carved from frost. Gas lamps glowed in halos of fog. The Thames lay silent under patches of ice, its usual bustle reduced to eerie stillness. The air smelled of coal smoke and damp wool. Families pressed together inside, telling stories by the light of a single candle, its flickering flame painting shadows on soot-streaked walls. It wasn't luxury, it wasn't comfort, but it was enough to remind them of what they were fighting for: another day, another night, another chance at survival. London's poor didn't just endure the winter of 1895. They carried one another through it, piece by piece, ember by ember, laugh by laugh. And that, more than anything else, is what kept the frozen city alive. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the city didn't rest. It braced itself. Night was when the cold came hardest, seeping into every corner, pressing against walls like an uninvited guest that refused to leave. The tenements, already crumbling, seemed to groan under the weight of frost. Wooden beams cracked as ice tightened its grip, and the air inside felt heavy, almost wet, with dampness that never dried. Imagine a family gathered in one small room, 4, sometimes 6 or more souls, sharing a space no bigger than a modern living room. The plaster on the walls was cracked, streaked black with soot, and patches of mildew spread where moisture clung stubbornly. Curtains, if they existed, were thin rags that barely moved against the draft, sneaking in from broken panes. The moment a candle was blown out, the shadows grew long, the air turned sharper, and silence thickened until even the sound of coughing seemed amplified. Fires were rationed. A handful of coal was expected to last hours, so fathers sat awake, coaxing embers with bits of wood and paper, praying the glow would stretch until morning. Children curled against their mothers, toes tucked under skirts, fingers pressed into their fathers' palms for warmth. Sleep was shallow, interrupted by shivers or sudden drafts that snaked beneath the door. And yet, even then, there was tenderness. Mothers tucked children's hands into their own. Fathers broke crusts of bread into tiny pieces so each child could believe they'd had enough. The sounds of a tenement night were haunting. A baby's cry filtered through the thin walls, met by another mother's quiet shushing. From above came the steady thump of boots, pacing someone too cold or too anxious to lie still. In another room, a wet cough rattled the silence, reminding neighbors of illness lurking in the damp air. And yet, through these noises, you could sense connection. No one was truly alone. They were bound by the shared struggle. By morning, survival demanded action again. Men trudged to the docks, hats pulled low, breath steaming in the gray dawn. Hundreds gathered at the riverfront, waiting to hear a foreman call names for work. It was a cruel lottery. Some returned home with wages, others with nothing but empty pockets and heavier hearts. Factories offered the same grim gamble. Long lines of men and women queued, hoping for even the dirtiest, most back-breaking tasks. Overseers picked a few, waved away the rest. Even children worked. Boys shouted headlines on street corners, voices hoarse in the icy air, their small fingers fumbling to fold stiff newspapers. Others ran errands, slipping on icy cobbles as they carried notes or parcels for pennies. Girls waited outside bakeries and butchers, clutching coins in mittenless hands, hoping to bring home scraps. Childhood was brief. Play came only in snatches, stolen between labor and hunger, and always sickness hovered. Bronchitis, pneumonia, influenza, words that meant dread. In rooms with no ventilation, coughs spread like fire. Mothers boiled onions and herbs, pressed hot cloths against tiny chests, whispered prayers into damp night air. Hospitals were overcrowded, charity infirmaries understaffed. For the poor, healing often depended on neighbors, a shared spoon of honey, a borrowed blanket, an extra piece of coal to keep the fire alive through the worst of the fever. Yet even here, resilience shone. Neighbors nursed each other's children when mothers collapsed from exhaustion. Old women handed down remedies, some useless, some effective, but all offered with care. A single apple sliced into thin wedges might be shared among several children, the freshness like medicine itself. Amid hardship, humanity endured. And when evening returned, so did the ritual of the hearth. Families gathered around the flicker of flame, telling stories to distract little ones from gnawing stomachs. Shadows danced on the walls, turning soot into imagined castles or forests. Laughter, rare but real, sometimes broke through a child's giggle at a silly tale, a father's chuckle at a memory of better days. Those sounds, fragile and fleeting, carried more warmth than the fire itself. London's winter of 1895 was merciless, but in its cruelty it revealed the stubborn strength of ordinary people. They fought for each ember, for each loaf, for each day. And while the city groaned under frost, inside those crowded rooms, hope smoldered quietly. Not bright, not easy, but steady enough to last one more night, one more dawn. By day, London's streets came alive again. Though alive was hardly the word. The city stirred, yes, but every movement carried the weight of frost. The air was heavy with coal smoke and fog, and footsteps crunched on icy cobblestones as families hurried toward the markets. The winter markets weren't grand displays of abundance. They were bare bones, survival-driven stalls, a few turnips here, a sack of coal there, a scrap of meat for those who could spare the coins. Vendors stood bundled in ragged coats, shouting hoarsely over the muffled hum of the crowd, their breath plumed white, mingling with the steam rising from roasted chestnuts or the sharp smell of salted fish. The entire scene was a contradiction, bleak and harsh, yet buzzing with a kind of desperate energy. Mothers haggled fiercely, voices edged with both determination and fatigue. Every coin mattered, every halfpenny stretched as far as possible. Children clung to skirts, eyes wide as they watched bread pulled fresh from ovens, steam rising into the frosty air. Some were lucky enough to taste a crust handed over by a generous vendor. Others simply looked on, memorizing the smell, the sight, storing it away like a promise. And though hunger weighed heavily, the markets held something else too: connection. Neighbors exchanged nods, quick words of advice, even small blessings. One woman might whisper where coal was cheapest that morning. Another might slip an extra potato into the hand of a struggling mother. Survival was individual, but endurance was collective. Still, not everyone had the means to buy even scraps. For those, soup kitchens became lifelines. Imagine stepping off the freezing street into a dim room filled with the smell of boiling broth. Steam curled upward, thawing stiff fingers and easing frozen lungs. Volunteers, men, women, sometimes children themselves, ladled soup into chipped bowls, handing them out with words of encouragement. The soup was simple: turnips, carrots, barley, thin strips of meat if the day was generous. And yet, for a starving child, each spoonful was magic. Cheeks flushed with warmth, eyes brightened, and laughter even flickered again as bellies filled. Parents sat nearby, cradling bowls like treasures, letting the heat seep through into their bones. The soup kitchens weren't just about food. They were sanctuaries of dignity, places where strangers became kin for an hour, bound by both hardship and the small reprieve of nourishment. And while adults sought markets and kitchens, children carved joy out of ice itself. In alleys and courtyards, their laughter broke through the gloom. Snowballs flew between sooty walls, wooden crates became sleds, and cobblestones turned into makeshift racetracks. It wasn't safe, fingers went numb, falls left bruises, but those moments mattered. Parents watching from windows sometimes smiled despite themselves. That fragile sound of play was proof. The spirit of childhood could survive even the harshest frost. Beyond the markets and games, the River Thames stood transformed. Normally a bustling artery, its waters now lay frozen, a shimmering, silvery ribbon through the city. By moonlight, it looked almost otherworldly, reflecting gas lamps and fog in ghostly patterns. Some men tried to fish through holes in the ice. Others cut blocks of frozen water to sell in neighborhoods with no clean supply. Every step on the river was a gamble. The ice creaked ominously, and a fall meant death. Yet necessity drove them onto that glassy surface. For families who lived near the banks, the Thames was both beauty and terror. Children pressed noses against frosted panes to watch it glimmer. Women lingered on bridges, scanning for husbands returning with catches or chunks of ice. Even in its frozen state, the river fed the city, demanded from it, and mirrored its struggle. Danger and survival twined together on those icy waters, just as they did in every cramped tenement and every crowded stall. And so London endured. By market trade, by steaming bowls of broth, by children's laughter, and by the ever-present river, life carried on. Fragile, yes. Brutal, often. But alive. When the markets closed and the last bowls of soup had been handed out, London shifted into another rhythm. The streets felt quieter, muffled under layers of frost and fog. Gas lamps flickered weakly in the mist, throwing pale circles of light that barely pierced the darkness. For most families, this was the hour of retreat, huddling inside, gathering close to fire and candle. But the city never truly slept. The night watch moved through alleys and streets, lanterns swinging with each step. Their boots crunched softly on ice, and every echo carried far in the stillness. To children peeking through shutters, those dim lights were both mysterious and reassuring. Parents nodded quietly as patrolmen passed, grateful for their presence. The watchmen weren't saviors, but they were symbols, proof that even in a city blanketed with cold, someone kept vigil. Inside the tenements, the hearth became the center of life. A single flame meant survival. Fathers carefully placed the last lumps of coal, coaxing embers into a glow. Mothers fanned the fire with measured breaths, careful not to waste the little kindling left. Children sat close, hands outstretched, faces red from the heat but unwilling to pull back. The crackle of fire filled the silence, a small, steady heartbeat against the roar of the winter outside. But not all fires burned bright. Many households rationed fuel so tightly that warmth flickered only briefly before dying down. Blankets were wrapped around shoulders, beds pressed close together, and candles shielded from drafts. When one flame sputtered, all eyes followed. Breaths held, as if willing it to stay alive. Each ember felt precious, each spark of victory. And still, the cold found its way in. The real enemy wasn't always the frost in the air, it was the damp. Moisture seeped through brick and wood, settling into clothes, blankets, and even lungs. Walls grew slick with condensation, and mold whispered its presence in the corners. Children coughed, their breath rattling in the damp chill. The elderly, frail already, suffered stiff joints and endless shivers. Mothers tried everything, hanging wet garments near fires, rubbing their children's hands until they were warm again, pressing hot cloths against fevered cheeks. Fathers carried logs through icy streets, each one a back-breaking load, but enough to bring relief. Every effort was a negotiation with winter itself, a bargain struck with sweat, patience, and exhaustion. And, yet, in that struggle, there was tenderness. Families leaned on each other, pressed closer in shared beds, whispered encouragement in the dark. Even in damp rooms where the air was heavy and every breath seemed to chill, they found comfort in proximity, in the rhythm of heartbeats and the warmth of human bodies. So, as the night stretched on and frost laced the windows with intricate patterns, London's poor endured. Between patrolmen's lanterns, the glow of fragile hearths, and the quiet courage of families, life persisted in the face of the city's most merciless winter. Morning in London during the winter of 1895 did not arrive with ease. The first light crept slowly across the rooftops, filtered by heavy fog, turning the city into a pale blur of gray and silver. Frost still clung stubbornly to every window pane, to cobblestones slick with ice, and to the soot-streaked chimneys that crowned the skyline. Yet, even in that bitter stillness, dawn brought something vital, the sense that another night had been endured. Families emerged from cramped rooms, wrapped in threadbare coats, clutching bundles of firewood, scraps of bread, or the blankets that had carried them through the night. Their faces were pale, marked by fatigue, but in their steps was quiet determination. Survival meant movement. Fires needed fuel. Children needed food. The city called them back into its frozen streets. Street vendors appeared first, voices carrying through the fog as they set out what little they had. Bread loaves that were smaller than usual, turnips still dusted with frost, tiny sacks of coal sold by the handful. Mothers haggled fiercely, their voices sharp with desperation but softened by gratitude when a vendor slipped in an extra piece. Every coin, every scrap mattered. Children followed closely, cheeks flushed from cold, eyes wide as they watched the markets hum with fragile life. Their laughter, faint but real, floated between stalls, a small rebellion against hunger and frost. Neighbors exchanged nods, sometimes brief smiles, sometimes advice whispered quickly. Where soup kitchens might open, which streets were safest to walk, who among them had fallen sick overnight. And then there was the river, the Thames, still frozen in wide sheets of glassy silver. By dawn, men tested its edges carefully, cutting through the ice to fish, or dragging driftwood from its frozen banks. Women and children watched from bridges, their breaths clouding in the morning chill, praying silently that no misstep would send a loved one into the deadly water below. From the chimneys rose thin streams of smoke, curling faintly into the morning sky. Each one was a quiet victory, proof that somewhere inside, a hearth still glowed. A meal was being prepared, and warmth had been wrestled, however briefly, from the grip of the cold. But dawn was not just survival. It carried symbolism too. Every pale shaft of sunlight breaking through the fog felt like a promise that the city would endure. Every nod exchanged between weary neighbors was a pact that they were in this together. Every step taken into the frozen streets was another affirmation that, even when stripped bare by hunger, damp, and frost, London's poor refused to yield. And so, as the day began, the city stirred once more. It was not triumphant, not easy, but it was steady, enduring, deeply human. As the pale sun climbed higher, the city of London revealed both its wounds and its resilience. The fog still clung to the streets, softening the outlines of chimneys and rooftops, while frost sparkled faintly on window ledges and railings. For a moment, the frozen city almost looked beautiful, as though the hardship had been cloaked in silver. But beauty could not mask the truth. The cold was merciless, and life demanded endurance. Church bells broke the silence, their solemn toll carrying through the alleys, bouncing off soot-streaked walls. For the poor, the bells were more than markers of time. They were reminders of continuity, of faith, of something larger than hunger and frost. Many paused their labors for just a breath, letting the sound wash over them, a fragile thread tying their weary spirits to the rhythm of the city. Children, ever resourceful, turned the streets into their playgrounds. On icy cobblestones, they invented games, from nothing sliding across frozen puddles, sculpting small forts from crates and snow, tossing snowballs that left their fingers aching but their laughter ringing. For parents, the sight was bittersweet. That laughter was a brief flame, warming hearts in a season where joy was rare. It did not erase the cold or fill empty stomachs, but it reminded everyone that the human spirit could still find light, even in shadows. Vendors called out in the markets, their voices echoing in the mist. The sharp scent of coal, mixed with the faint, yeasty aroma of bread, the earthy tang of turnips, and, if luck allowed, the sweetness of roasted chestnuts. Families moved slowly through the stalls, stretching coins as far as they could. Some bartered coal for bread, others traded scraps of firewood for vegetables. It was not commerce in the usual sense, it was survival woven into every gesture, every word. And yet, amid the frost-bitten hands and weary eyes, moments of kindness appeared. A vendor quietly slipping an extra potato into a mother's bag. A child sharing mittens with a friend. A neighbor handing over half a loaf with nothing expected in return. These were not grand acts, but in that frozen city they carried weight. They were warmth of another kind, the kind no hearth or blanket alone could provide. By afternoon, the streets seemed almost to hum with this fragile rhythm, the clatter of carts, the muffled footfalls on ice, the murmur of quiet conversations layered together, a chorus of endurance. And always, in the background, the distant river lay silent under sheets of silver ice, a reminder that nature ruled with an unforgiving hand. Daylight did not bring comfort. It brought duties, struggles, and the constant negotiation with cold and hunger. Yet, within those hours, there were sparks in the ring of a bell, the laughter of children, the kindness of neighbors that reminded Londoners they were still alive, still enduring, still human. As daylight faded, the city slipped into another kind of struggle. The fog thickened, curling low across alleys and rooftops, wrapping the poor quarters in a damp shroud. Gas lamps flickered into life one by one, their halos blurring in the mist, until they seemed more like ghosts than sources of light. Shadows stretched long across the cobblestones, and every sound, the creak of a shutter, the scrape of a boot, the toll of a distant church bell, seemed amplified in the hush. It was in these hours that the night watchmen took to the streets. Their lanterns cast dim circles of light that barely reached beyond their boots. Yet for families huddled inside drafty tenements, that glow carried reassurance. Children peeked from windows at the silhouettes of these figures moving steadily through the cold, while parents nodded quietly, knowing that someone was still watching, still guarding, even when the city felt abandoned to frost. The watchman's task was far from easy. Ice slicked the stones beneath their feet, fog robbed them of sight, and the cold gnawed at their bones despite layers of wool and leather. They listened for trouble, the crackle of a fire that might spread, the cry of a sick neighbor, or the shuffle of someone in distress. Every measured step was both duty and endurance, a reminder that vigilance could not sleep even when warmth was scarce. Inside, families strained to hear those soft signals of protection, the muffled crunch of boots on snow, the faint whistle of a patrolman cutting through the mist. For the poor, these sounds blended with the murmur of prayers, the low crackle of embers, and the slow, steady breathing of children under patched quilts. The city might be cold and merciless, but those rhythms promised continuity, safety, and a thread of humanity running through the night. And yet, the silence of the midnight streets carried its own kind of beauty. Moonlight touched frozen puddles, turning them into silver mirrors. Frost clung to iron railings, like lace spun from glass. The Thames, glazed with ice, reflected the pale glow of lamps and stars, a ghostly ribbon stretching through the heart of London. Few dared walk its banks at that hour, but for those who did, the sight was unforgettable, a frozen world both terrifying and strangely serene. The poor, tucked in their beds, knew that the city outside was unforgiving, but they also knew that with each passing night survived, with every ember that glowed until dawn, they had triumphed once more over a season that seemed intent on breaking them. Night was not only a time of fear, it was also a time of quiet defiance, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, life went on. Inside the narrow walls of London's tenements, the hearth was the fragile heart of survival. Families gathered close to the faint glow, their faces streaked with soot, their breath visible even indoors. The fire rarely roared. Most nights, it was no more than a handful of glowing coals, coaxed into life by careful hands, and guarded as if it were a living creature that might vanish at the slightest neglect. Mothers leaned forward, fanning embers with patient breaths, while fathers broke small sticks of firewood into smaller pieces still, hoping to stretch the warmth for another hour. Children crouched nearby, clutching thin blankets around their shoulders, their eyes wide as the flicker of flames danced across the walls. The crackle of the fire, faint but steady, became a rhythm that gave structure to nights otherwise swallowed by silence. But the hearth was more than warmth. It was conversation. Around its glow, stories were told, prayers were whispered, and secrets were quietly shared. Older children recited tales of frost fairs on the Thames, handed down by grandparents who remembered livelier winters when hardship carried a festive mask. Parents soothed little ones with soft songs, weaving words into shields against the wind rattling outside. Even the elderly, their joints stiff and their hands trembling, found solace in the fire's light, knowing that for one more night the flame endured, and so did they. Food, when it could be prepared, was modest but precious. Thin broths of root vegetables simmered in cracked pots, their steam mingling with the smoke. A crust of bread toasted by the fire carried the fragrance of survival, filling the room with an aroma that, however simple, felt like luxury against the hunger pressing in from the streets. Each meal was stretched with ingenuity. More water, more herbs, a handful of scraps saved from the market. In that circle of warmth, time seemed to slow. The frost outside might bite into bricks and seep through window cracks, but within the glow of the hearth, families found a fragile sense of safety. The shadows it cast were long and wavering, transforming soot-stained walls into moving canvases, where children saw castles, forests, or figures of saints guarding them against the night. Every ember, every flicker of light was a declaration that life was still here, still stubborn, still unwilling to yield to the cruelty of a winter that pressed down with unrelenting force. In the hearth's embrace, London's poor discovered not only survival but dignity, the quiet strength of human bonds burning just as fiercely as the flames themselves. At dawn, the city's markets awoke beneath a blanket of frost. Stalls stood like rows of silent soldiers, their wooden planks dusted with ice, baskets stiff with cold, and vegetables glistening as though encased in glass. The air was sharp, cutting into skin, but it also carried the smell of survival earthy turnips, wilted cabbage, a hint of bread rising from nearby ovens, and the faint, sweet smoke of roasting chestnuts sold by street vendors. Mothers arrived early, their arms wrapped around baskets or tin pails, children trailing behind with red noses and wide, curious eyes. For them, every purchase was a negotiation with hunger. A bruised carrot, a cabbage with frost-bitten edges, a loaf of bread one day too old. Each item had value far beyond its cost, because each item meant one more day that the family would not go to bed hungry. The market stalls were crowded not with abundance, but with scarcity dressed up for sale. A mound of potatoes, their skins cracked from the cold. Small cuts of meat, pale and stiff, displayed in hopes that someone might still afford them. Fishmongers blew into their hands as they arranged silver-scaled herring, the steam from their breath mingling with the fog rolling in from the Thames. Haggling became survival. Voices low but firm, women bartered over pennies, offering 1 coin instead of 2, begging for a little more weight on the scale, or asking for a scrap of bread to be tucked into the deal. Some vendors, hardened by the season, shook their heads and clutched their goods tightly. Others, perhaps softened by the sight of shivering children, quietly slipped an extra turnip or a crust into the buyer's basket. These small mercies often carried more power than words. Children, too, learned to navigate the frozen markets. They darted between legs, hoping for dropped coins, a bruised apple rolling unnoticed, or the generosity of a vendor who pressed something small into their hands. Their excitement was quiet, almost secretive, but in those moments of triumph, their laughter cut through the gloom. The markets were also places of connection. Neighbors exchanged news while standing in line, whispers about which charity kitchens were serving soup, which coal vendor had lowered prices, or which alleys were less icy and safer to walk. Advice, encouragement, and even humor slipped between transactions, reminding everyone that while poverty isolated, community tied them back together. As the gray sky dimmed toward evening, families carried their meager purchases home, clutching them like treasures. The market stalls emptied slowly, the last cries of vendors fading into the frost-bitten air. What they carried was not much: a few vegetables, a handful of coal, perhaps a sliver of meat. But to the poor of London, these bundles were life itself. And the markets, harsh as they were, remained lifelines against the cruelty of winter. When darkness fell over London, the city took on a different character. Gas lamps flickered weakly through the fog, their circles of light barely cutting through the heavy mist. The wind carried the bite of frost through narrow alleys, rattling loose shutters and whistling beneath the doors of tenement homes. Most families retreated indoors, huddled beneath layers of blankets, but outside, another rhythm of life began. The night watch took their posts. Boots crunched against icy cobblestones, slow and deliberate. Each step echoed through the frozen streets like a steady heartbeat, a quiet reminder that someone was still awake, still watching, still guarding. The men carried lanterns, their faint glow sweeping across soot-streaked walls and catching the breath of stray cats darting between refuse heaps. In a city where hunger, illness, and cold pressed in from every side, the watchmen were not just guards against crime. They were protectors of the vulnerable. Children peered out through frosted panes, their eyes wide, as a lantern's glow passed by. Parents nodded silently when they heard the faint whistle of a patrol, knowing it meant someone was close if trouble struck. The poor had little reason to trust authority in their daily lives, but in the heart of winter, even a single figure moving through the streets with purpose became a kind of reassurance. The work was thankless. The fog was so thick that a man could barely see his hand in front of his face. Ice made every corner a hazard, and more than once a watchman slipped, cursing quietly as he steadied himself with a frozen handrail. Their fingers stiffened in their gloves, toes numbed in boots that were never quite warm enough. And yet they pressed forward. They checked the tenements, listening for fires that had gone out, watching for families who might be at risk of freezing through the night. They kept an eye out for thieves too, men desperate enough to steal coal or bread from the already starving. But their presence carried something more powerful than safety. It carried continuity. The sound of a lantern pole tapping gently against stone, the muffled crunch of steps passing under windows, these became lullabies to the poor. Families lying awake in drafty rooms whispered that the watch had passed by, and with that, sleep came easier. The night watch didn't stop the frost. They didn't banish hunger or cure illness. But in those long hours when the city seemed suspended between survival and despair, their steady presence stitched the darkness with a fragile thread of hope. The poorest Londoners, wrapped in blankets too thin for the season, could close their eyes, knowing they were not entirely alone. For the poor of London, firewood was more precious than silver. In the winter of 1895, when frost crept through walls and fog smothered every street, a single log could mean the difference between warmth and shivering through the night. Families scavenged wherever they could. Men scoured alleys for discarded crates. Women bargained with vendors in frozen markets. And children learned early to spot twigs and scraps along the icy banks of the Thames. Picture it. A boy of 7, his coat patched 3 times over, balancing a bundle of damp sticks in his arms while his mother urged him along the slippery cobblestones. A father, shoulders hunched, carrying a crate broken down into planks scavenged from behind a shop. Even neighbors traded wood like currency, swapping a handful of kindling for a slice of bread or a cup of soup. Every ember mattered. Children were taught to treat fire as if it were gold. They learned how to blow gently on the coals, how to shield them from drafts, how to coax a spark into flame without wasting precious fuel. Lighting the hearth became almost ceremonial. Flint striking against steel, a wisp of smoke curling upward, the first lick of flame catching on paper or straw, and then relief. Faces lit orange, hands stretched out, sighs of gratitude rising as the cold retreated just a little, but warmth was fleeting. Logs burned down too quickly, embers cooled before dawn, and smoke often filled the room when damp wood was all a family could find. Still, even a small fire transformed the tenement. Shadows danced on soot-stained walls, joints thawed, and children drifted to sleep to the gentle crackle of flames. In those brief hours, families remembered what comfort felt like. The smell of wood smoke became part of daily life, mingling with coal soot and the faint aroma of meager meals. It clung to clothing, to hair, to every surface of the room, and yet no one complained. That scent was survival itself. It meant porridge simmering, hands thawing, and bodies gathering close. For the poor, firewood was more than heat. It was reassurance. It was a sign that their effort, their long walks through frost-bitten alleys, their aching backs from hauling bundles, had been worth it. Each spark was a victory over a winter that seemed determined to grind them down. And in the glow of those fragile flames, resilience was passed from parent to child, generation to generation, like an inheritance written not in wealth, but in endurance. In the frozen streets of London, fire and blankets could only do so much. The real enemy crept in slowly, unseen at first, until the damage was irreversible. Frostbite. It was the thief that stole fingers, toes, and sometimes entire limbs, especially from those who had nothing but thin shoes and patched coats to shield them. Imagine standing for hours on a street corner, selling newspapers with the wind cutting through your scarf. At first, your hands tingle, then they turn pale. Soon, you can't even feel the coins you're supposed to count. By the end of the day, your fingertips are stiff, purple, and raw with pain. This was the reality for countless boys and men earning pennies in the bitter cold. Dock workers hauling ropes found their grip weakening. Water carriers felt their hands burn as they gripped freezing metal. Mothers walking long distances for coal often returned with ears blistered and cheeks scarred by the icy air. Children, too, suffered. Their small boots filled with melted snow, and by the time they made it home, their toes were numb to the bone. Inside the tenements, relief was limited. A thin fire could thaw stiff fingers, but it could not undo the damage. Mothers rubbed their children's hands and feet, whispering encouragement, trying to restore circulation. Neighbors wrapped each other's extremities in scraps of wool or rags, offering what protection they could. Doctors advised warm water and gentle massage, but for most, medical help was far out of reach. The pain was relentless. Hands that once stitched clothes or handled tools could no longer bend. Toes blackened. And yet, life had to continue. Hunger didn't wait for wounds to heal. Families still needed coal, water, and food. So, the poor pressed on, even as their bodies betrayed them. But within this suffering was also resilience. Every saved finger, every child whose feet were kept warm by borrowed boots, every neighbor who gave up gloves so someone else might endure, these were triumphs. Quiet victories against an unforgiving season. Frostbite may have been the silent thief of London's poorest, but their defiance against it became a symbol of the human will. Each hand rubbed back to life, each step taken on aching feet, was proof that even in the coldest winter, the spirit of survival burned hotter than the frost outside. That winter, the Thames was no longer the river of bustling barges and echoing dockside shouts. It lay still, muted, covered in a shimmering skin of ice that stretched across its surface like a mirror of pale glass. For many, the sight was breathtaking moonlight, turning the river into a silver ribbon, fog curling low across its banks, the entire city reflected in a ghostly glow. But beneath that beauty lurked danger. Men, desperate to feed their families, walked the river's edges, testing patches of ice for strength. A crack beneath their boots could mean a plunge into freezing water, where even the strongest swimmer would struggle to survive. Children dared each other to venture onto the frozen surface, their laughter carrying through the fog as mothers stood by with hearts in their throats, knowing a single misstep could end in tragedy. Yet, the Thames also offered opportunity. Some cut holes into the ice, lowering makeshift lines into the black water below in hopes of catching a fish. Others scavenged driftwood or broken crates washed up on the banks, precious scraps that could keep a fire alive for another night. In places where the ice held firm, men carved blocks to haul back to nearby businesses, selling frozen slabs as a crude substitute for storage. There was an eerie stillness on the river. The usual clamor of trade was gone, replaced by the muffled crunch of boots, the groan of shifting ice, and the distant caw of crows circling overhead. From bridges, Londoners gazed down in awe. Soot-stained buildings seemed softened by the frost, their reflections shimmering faintly on the icy expanse below. For the poor, the Thames was a paradox. It was danger and lifeline, beauty and cruelty all at once. To some, it whispered opportunity. To others, it was a grave waiting to swallow the careless. And yet, like the people who depended on it, the river endured. Beneath the frozen shell, the water still flowed, reminding everyone that London itself, even when silenced by frost, never truly stopped moving. Amid the frost and fog, when hunger gnawed and fires burned too low, soup kitchens opened their doors like beacons of survival. For the poor of London, These humble halls were more than places to eat. They were sanctuaries, brief shelters, against a world that seemed determined to freeze them out. Long before dawn, lines stretched down icy streets. Men with hollow cheeks shuffled forward in threadbare coats. Mothers clutched children against their skirts, and the elderly leaned on sticks, shivering as they waited for the doors to open. The smell hit first, the thick steam of boiling broth, the earthy sweetness of carrots and turnips, the yeasty promise of bread. To those in line, it was as good as music, a signal that relief was near. Inside, giant cauldrons bubbled over crackling fires. Volunteers moved steadily, ladling soup into battered tin bowls and passing out crusts of bread. It was simple food broth, thinned with water, scraps of meat barely more than flavoring, vegetables cut into tiny cubes, but in that season, it was nothing short of a feast. A single ladleful could mean the difference between fainting from hunger and standing strong for another day's labor. Children brightened first, their faces flushed as the warmth seeped through their fingers wrapped around steaming bowls. Laughter returned in small bursts, echoing softly against the walls. Parents sat straighter, shoulders no longer sagging, as they watched little ones eat with ravenous relief. For a moment, the cold lost its grip, and it wasn't only about food. Soup kitchens gave something even rarer: dignity. Neighbors exchanged advice, strangers offered nods of solidarity, and ministers or volunteers spoke words of comfort. Someone might share how to stretch coal, another where to find cheaper bread, or simply a story to make others smile. In those cramped, smoky rooms, people found not only nourishment but community. By evening, when families left with full stomachs and scraps to carry home, they carried something more intangible too: the memory of kindness. The knowledge that even in a city strangled by ice and poverty, compassion still lived. For many, the soup kitchen meant survival. For others, it meant hope. And for all, it was proof that in the darkest winters, human generosity could burn brighter than any hearth. In rooms no bigger than a closet, where plaster peeled from damp walls and the wind slipped through every crack, the bed became more than furniture. It was survival. Families, sometimes 3 generations deep, crowded into narrow frames or mattresses laid directly on the floor. Quilts were thin, blankets patched and worn, but together they became a cocoon against the frost. Children nestled between their parents, their breath warm against tired skin. A mother wrapped an arm around her youngest, tucking tiny feet beneath her skirt to shield them from the draft. Fathers pulled the outer blankets tight, shoulders squared against the cold, as though their bodies could block the winter itself. Even grandparents joined, their frail hands clutching the hands of grandchildren, passing warmth across generations like an unspoken prayer. These shared beds held more than body heat. They carried whispers, quiet conversations meant to soothe restless minds. A child asked why the wind howled so loud, and an older sibling invented a story, perhaps about giants blowing across rooftops or angels shaking the chimneys. Parents hummed lullabies, voices cracked from exhaustion but soft with tenderness. For a few moments, the creaks of the building and the groan of the wind outside were replaced by stories and song. Yet there was a fragility to this intimacy. Every shift of a blanket risked letting in the draft. A cough in the dark brought worry, a reminder that sickness spread easily when everyone slept so close. But despite the fear, no one would trade places. In those cramped beds, the poorest of London found not just warmth, but proof they were not alone. The sensation was raw, human. The warmth of another's breath, the steady rhythm of a heartbeat beneath your ear, the reassuring weight of a hand across your shoulder. These were comforts more powerful than coal or firewood could provide. In a city gripped by cold and hunger, that closeness was its own form of survival. As night deepened and frost pressed harder at the windows, the shared beds became small islands of life in the frozen city. They were sanctuaries where children dreamed of spring, where parents guarded those dreams with their bodies, and where love itself, fragile, imperfect, but unyielding, kept the cold at bay. In a city swallowed by fog and frost, where daylight vanished too quickly and nights stretched endlessly, the glow of a candle was more than illumination. It was life itself. One small flame could soften a room, turn cracked walls into golden canvases, and give a family something to gather around when the world outside felt merciless. Candles were precious, guarded carefully as though they were coins. A single taper might have to last for several nights, its wax rationed inch by inch. Families learned tricks to make the light endure, trimming wicks just so, shielding flames from drafts, or melting scraps together into makeshift candles. Even children understood the value, cupping their hands around the flicker whenever a gust threatened to snuff it out. Around this fragile glow, life unfolded in rhythms both practical and tender. Mothers rocked babies in the soft light, their faces half shadowed, half golden. Fathers patched worn boots or mended tools while the wax dripped slowly down. Children, eyes wide with wonder, traced shapes in the dancing shadows, castles, dragons, and forests painted across the walls by the trembling flame. For them, imagination made the cold room larger, brighter, almost magical. The scent of tallow or wax mingled with coal smoke and damp wool, thick in the air yet comforting in its own way. It told of survival, of light coaxed from the simplest materials, of endurance when everything else seemed fragile. And in that glow, faces softened. Worry lines smoothed for a moment, weary shoulders lowered, and even the sick looked calmer under the candle's warmth. When the flame burned low, there was always a pang of dread. Without light, the night pressed heavier. The frost seemed to creep closer, and silence grew unbearable. That's why families lingered near the candle, talking quietly until the last moment, stretching every second of its company. It was never just about seeing in the dark. It was about believing the dark could be held back, even for a little while. And so, in tenements across London, these tiny flames carried enormous weight. They were guardians of hope, sentinels of safety, and fragile promises that tomorrow could be endured. For in the heart of the harshest winter, one flicker of light could remind the poor that they were not yet defeated, that their spirit, like the flame, still burned. While frost clung to rooftops and fog filled the narrow lanes, there were still doors in London that opened not for profit, but for mercy. Churches, mission, halls, and small charitable societies became sanctuaries of survival. They could not erase hunger or banish the cold, but they gave something just as vital, the assurance that someone cared. At dawn, church bells rang faintly through the mist, calling not only to worship, but also to the weary who lined up outside kitchens and parish halls. Men in threadbare coats, women carrying infants, Children clutching empty tins all waited patiently, shifting from one numb foot to the other. The air was thick with the smell of boiling potatoes and thin broth simmering in iron pots. To many, that aroma was more comforting than any sermon. Inside, volunteers moved quietly but with purpose. They ladled steaming soup into cracked bowls, slipped crusts of bread into small hands, and handed out scraps of coal wrapped in old newspapers. Their faces were tired too, but their presence carried warmth that no fire alone could give. A kind word, a smile, even a gentle pat on a child's head reminded London's poor that they were not invisible. For children, charity days felt like holidays. A sweet treat, a cup of hot tea, or even the chance to sit by a stove brought joy that glowed brighter than the candles at home. Mothers exhaled relief as they accepted a parcel of clothing or a shawl, knowing it might keep a baby alive through the next freezing night. Fathers, though proud, bowed their heads in gratitude when a minister slipped them an extra coal lump or a blanket. Beyond food and fuel, these places offered connection. Neighbors exchanged news about coal deliveries, remedies for frostbite, or warnings about sickness spreading through the alleys. The elderly told stories of past winters, weaving hope and caution into every word. Children played quietly in corners, their laughter soft against the hum of conversation. For a brief time, the hall was more than a shelter, it was community, a fragile but real network of survival. When families left, carrying small bundles of bread or bits of fuel, their arms were heavier than when they arrived, but their hearts, somehow, lighter. The streets outside were still bitter and gray, yet something intangible lingered, the reminder that compassion, even when modest, could push back against despair. In the winter of 1895, charity was no grand gesture. It was a loaf of bread, a shared ember, a pair of second-hand gloves. But to those who received them, it was proof that London's heart still beat beneath the ice, and that endurance was never theirs to bear alone. Even in the heart of London's frozen misery, laughter still found its way into the cracks of hardship. It came not often, and never without cost, but when it did, it felt like sunlight breaking through a storm. In alleyways dusted with snow, children chased one another over icy puddles, slipping and shrieking with glee. Their cheeks burned red from cold, their hands stiff, yet their giggles rose above the frost like bells ringing in defiance. A lump of coal found in the street could spark a celebration. A snowball fight in the shadow of tenements could make them forget hunger for a heartbeat. Inside cramped rooms, families huddled under blankets and told jokes in whispers. Fathers, their bodies worn from hauling coal or wood, teased their little ones just to see a smile. Mothers, though exhausted, managed to laugh when a child's story turned silly, or when candlelight threw strange shadows that became giants and dragons on the wall. Those shadows frightened no one. Instead, they became characters in bedtime tales, softened by humor and imagination. Neighbors, too, shared brief moments of mirth. A funny remark while standing in a soup line. A shared chuckle over a dog slipping clumsily on ice. Even in the gray silence, people found ways to laugh together, because sometimes laughter was the only defense left against despair. The sound of it lingered. It bounced off brick walls, slipped through frosted panes, and curled into alleys where sorrow usually lived. It was not carefree laughter, but weighted with struggle, tempered by hunger and illness. And yet, precisely because it was rare, it felt precious. For the children, these moments became shields. A memory of a snowball fight or a shared story under candlelight gave them strength to face another cold dawn. For parents, the sound of laughter was a reminder that their children's spirits had not been crushed, that life, fragile though it was, still pulsed with joy. Even brief, even faint, that laughter was a flame. It warmed without coal, it nourished without bread, and it carried hope where everything else seemed stripped away. In the harsh winter of 1895, joy itself became an act of survival. When the first light of dawn stretched across London's skyline, it did not erase the frost, but it softened it. The cobblestones still glittered with ice, roofs still held their heavy crowns of snow, and chimneys still puffed thin trails of smoke into the gray sky. Yet that faint golden shimmer of morning told the weary poor that they had survived one more night. The streets stirred slowly. Mothers opened creaking doors, children bundled in patched shawls clung to skirts, and fathers carried bundles of wood or empty baskets, ready to try again at the markets. The city exhaled, weary but alive. Vendors, stamping their feet for warmth, began to set up their stalls. The calls of street sellers, muffled by scarves, carried faintly through the fog. Coal dust hung in the air, the acrid scent of survival, while the faint sweetness of bread from a bakery reminded everyone of life's small mercies. Children's voices broke the silence first. Their laughter rose softly over the frozen lanes, weaker than the day before, but still defiant, still bright. It mingled with the distant creak of carts, the bark of dogs, and the toll of church bells marking the morning hour. Neighbors greeted each other with tired but hopeful smiles. A nod at the corner, a whispered, "Did you sleep?" Or, "Have you heard if the soup kitchen opens early today?" These fragments of conversation carried more than words, they carried comfort. In a season where frost tried to isolate, human voices stitched the city together. Inside cramped rooms, fires were coaxed back to life. A few lumps of coal, a handful of kindling, or even splinters of scavenged wood were fed into small stoves. Pots of thin porridge began to bubble, sending curls of steam into the air. Mothers tucked blankets tighter around little ones. Fathers checked shoes patched with rags, and grandparents murmured prayers of thanks for another day. Each movement was small, each gesture deliberate, yet all of them formed a rhythm of persistence. Dawn did not bring abundance, but it brought possibility, the chance to earn a coin, to share a bowl of broth, to trade news, to endure together. And in that pale light, as chimneys breathed their smoky trails into the cold sky and the frozen Thames reflected the gold of morning, London's poor carried on. Scarcity remained. Frost lingered. Hunger still gnawed. But so too did resilience, woven into every step, every glance, every whispered encouragement. The dawn of hope in frozen London was not loud or triumphant. It was quiet, fragile, and deeply human, proof that even in the harshest winter, life found a way forward. Morning gave way to the grind of survival. By midday, London's streets pulsed with the weary determination of thousands who had no choice but to keep moving. The fog still clung low, swallowing the sound of wheels and footsteps, while icicles dangled from rooflines like fragile daggers waiting to fall. Men crowded at the docks, breath steaming as they jostled for work. The foreman's voice cut through the frost, calling out names at random. Some cheered softly when chosen, clutching the chance to earn a few pennies. Others turned away empty-handed, shoulders bent, as if the weight of rejection pressed harder than the cold itself. For them, the day became a hunt, not for opportunity, but for scraps, favors, and the mercy of neighbors. Women filled the markets, their voices hushed but firm, as they bargained over turnips spotted with frost or loaves of bread already going stale. Every coin was spent as if it were the last, each purchase a calculation between hunger tonight and hunger tomorrow. Children hovered at their sides, clutching tin pails, eyes darting towards stalls that displayed oranges or chestnuts, luxuries they could rarely taste but always admired. The city carried two rhythms at once, the clamor of survival and the quiet pulse of compassion. A baker slipped a broken roll into a child's hand. A fishmonger whispered to a mother that she could take the smaller catch for half price. Even in want, generosity flickered like a candle flame against the draft. By afternoon, the cold deepened again. Fog grew heavier, muting the city into shades of gray. Chimneys coughed, streams of smoke that mingled with soot and frost, cloaking neighborhoods in a haze that smelled of both survival and struggle. Children ran errands, boots slipping on icy stones, shouting headlines of the day's papers until their voices cracked. In alleyways, elderly men leaned against walls, catching their breath, their coughs echoing harshly in the damp air. Yet life never stopped. Street vendors rang their bells, offering steaming mugs of weak tea or roasted chestnuts, the heat as much a comfort as the taste. The sound of horses' hooves clattered faintly over cobblestones, pulling carts heavy with coal or wood. Even as fingers went numb and stomachs clenched from hunger, London's poor kept moving, because standing still meant letting the frost win. In the heart of the city, amid fog and hardship, resilience was everywhere. In a father's back bent beneath a sack of firewood, in a mother's steady hands slicing bread thinner so it would last longer, in a child's laughter echoing for a moment between brick walls before fading into the gray. The day was no easier than the night before, but with each hour endured, another small victory was claimed. And in a winter determined to break them, that endurance was itself an act of quiet defiance. As evening crept back across the city, the streets grew quieter, the fog settling low like a heavy blanket. Gas lamps flickered to life, their halos of light swallowed almost immediately by the damp mist. Boots scraped over frozen cobblestones as weary workers returned home with whatever they had managed to earn or gather that day. Some carried bundles of firewood, others clutched loaves of bread close to their chests, protecting them as if they were treasures. Inside the tenements, survival shifted into ritual. Fires were coaxed to life with careful patience. A father leaned low, blowing softly on embers until sparks flared into thin flames. Children hovered nearby, eyes wide with relief when the fire caught, their faces glowing in the sudden warmth. Mothers prepared meals with steady hands, stretching every scrap into something that resembled dinner broth. From bones, bread softened in tea, potatoes boiled until their skins split. Families crowded around the hearth, knees touching, shoulders pressed close. Conversations were hushed, punctuated by coughs that rattled through the damp air. A grandmother told stories of winters long past, when the Thames had frozen solid enough to hold fairs, her voice weaving a fragile warmth into the room. Children leaned against her knees, listening, their imaginations momentarily lifting them out of hunger and cold. The tenement walls groaned with the wind, and frost crept across window panes in delicate white patterns. Drafts slipped under doors, tugging at blankets and coats. Yet even as the cold invaded, the hearth became a sanctuary. It was here that hope was kept alive, in the laughter that still managed to break through, in the songs whispered to lull children to sleep, in the prayers murmured over weak flames. Outside, the city exhaled in silence. The fog muffled voices and footsteps, turning alleys into shadowed corridors of frost. From some windows, candlelight glowed faintly, casting trembling silhouettes across the snow-dusted streets. The poor had little, but what they had, they clung to fiercely. The fragile comfort of family, the rhythm of breath in the dark, the steady beat of resilience against a winter that sought to take it all away. And so another night began, long, cold, and merciless, yet endured with tenderness, determination, and the quiet defiance of people who refused to surrender. As the city slipped deeper into night, the narrow alleys of London turned into silent corridors of frost and shadow. The snow that had fallen during the day now lay hardened into ice, slick across the cobblestones. Each step was a gamble. A misstep meant bruises at best, broken bones at worst. And in a winter like this, even a small injury could turn deadly. These alleys carried the smells of damp brick, coal smoke, and refuse half frozen in heaps. Stray dogs padded quietly in search of scraps. Rats scurried under broken crates, their squeaks carried by the still air. And yet, despite the danger, people kept moving. They had no choice. A loaf of bread left on a neighbor's table, a sack of coal carried home, a pot of broth shared between rooms. All these lifelines had to pass through these narrow, treacherous spaces. Children learned quickly how to navigate the maze. Their small feet darted across the ice, balancing baskets, tin pails, or scraps of firewood. Parents called softly after them, their voices muffled by fog. Lanterns hung from doorways, casting weak circles of light that barely reached the ground. Shadows stretched long and thin, making the alleys feel both endless and claustrophobic. And yet, within these shadowed lanes, acts of quiet kindness unfolded. A neighbor would press a roll of bread into a child's hand with a wink, whispering, "Don't tell." A woman, carrying a bundle of wood, would shift half into the arms of another family, knowing too well that survival was shared. Sometimes even a passing word, "Stay warm, God bless, we'll get through this," carried enough weight to make the frost feel less cruel. The night was dangerous, but it was also deeply human. The alleys echoed with small gestures of endurance, whispers of solidarity that cut through the cold. Every ember passed, every loaf shared, every hand lent in the dark, reminded London's poorest that though the winter was merciless, they were never entirely alone. And above it all, the city groaned under its blanket of frost, silent, weary, but alive. Hunger was not loud. It did not always scream or rage. Instead, it whispered, gnawed slowly, and sat heavy in the stomachs of London's poor during that brutal winter of 1895. It was the kind of hunger that made hands tremble when breaking a crust of bread, the kind that hollowed out cheeks and dulled once bright eyes. Families measured every crumb Mothers divided thin slices of bread with a precision that felt almost surgical, making sure each child received a portion, even if it meant she went without. Fathers sometimes worked long days only to come home with nothing but a stale heel of bread or a turnip bruised from frost. Many men simply chose not to eat so their children might have a chance at strength. The barter economy of poverty was everywhere. A small bundle of coal might be traded for a cup of soup, a torn blanket for a potato. Neighbors leaned on one another, not because it was easy, but because survival demanded it. And in that quiet exchange, bonds formed that were stronger than any contract of the wealthy. Children, with their sharp eyes and restless energy, became resourceful gatherers. They scoured markets for scraps of vegetables discarded at closing time, or trailed behind bakers hoping to catch a crust too burnt or too stale for sale. Tiny hands reached into the frost to pull up wilted greens, and the discovery of even a half-rotten carrot was celebrated like treasure. Yet hunger also bred ingenuity. Thin broths were stretched with water, weeds and roots boiled to mimic vegetables, and stale bread softened in tea or broth to fool the body into believing it was full. These meager meals were not feasts, but they were rituals of resilience, proof that even when the cupboard was bare, the will to endure found a way. At night, the ache of empty stomachs made sleep restless. Children clutched their bellies, and parents whispered promises that tomorrow might bring more. Still, in the darkest hours, families gathered close around what little they had: a spoonful of broth, a single potato cut into slices, and ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it were a banquet. Hunger defined that winter as much as the frost did. And yet, within the silence of rumbling stomachs, there was determination to share, to stretch, to endure. The people of London, though pressed to the edge, carried on with a stubborn grace that hunger itself could not erase. If hunger gnawed at the body, the cold invaded the bones. In the cramped tenements of London during that merciless winter of 1895, the wind was not just outside. It lived inside too, slithering through cracks in doors, hissing between warped window frames, and rattling loose shutters until the whole building seemed to sigh under its weight. Families fought it however they could. Threadbare curtains were pinned tight across windows. Old coats, worn-out shawls, and even sacks were nailed against door frames to block the drafts. Yet, the cold was clever. It found its way in anyway, creeping under doors, sneaking through chimneys, slipping along floorboards, until it settled in every joint and muscle. Children huddled together on shared mattresses, their breath puffing into the air like ghosts. Mothers wrapped little ones in layer after layer of clothing, sometimes putting socks on tiny hands to keep fingers from stiffening in the night. Fathers returned from the streets, stiff and aching, their faces raw from the wind, shaking off frost before stepping into rooms that felt barely warmer than the outside. The sound of the wind became part of life. It moaned like a restless spirit through alleyways. It rattled doors as though demanding entry, and at night it whispered endlessly, reminding the poor that winter did not sleep. But even in that unrelenting chill, families carved out pockets of warmth. A small hearth flickering low could become a sanctuary. Children pressed their hands close, feeling the sting of heat on numb fingers. Mothers whispered lullabies, their soft voices wrapping around little ones like another layer of blanket. Candles cast fragile halos of light that made rooms feel just a touch safer, their glow defying the wind outside. There was a kind of poetry in these nights. Shadows danced across walls, carrying with them the weight of both fear and resilience. A child's hair lifted by a draft became part of a story whispered by a mother of dragons, knights, or kingdoms far away. In these moments, the imagination burned brighter than any coal fire, keeping despair at bay. For the people of London, warmth was not just physical. It was shared through touch, through words, through the quiet determination to endure. Every layered blanket, every tightened scarf, every hand held close, was a declaration that the cold, no matter how fierce, would not claim their spirit. In a city locked in ice, the smallest flame became a guardian. For families crowded into soot-darkened rooms, the hearth was not just a fireplace. It was the heart of survival. Every ember was watched with a care that bordered on prayer. Fathers shifted coal with patient hands, coaxing the glow to last longer. Mothers leaned in close, blowing softly on reluctant sparks until they flared, while children sat wide-eyed, learning that warmth was never a gift. It was earned, protected, and cherished. The crackle of wood, the soft pop of coal, was like a lullaby against the wind that clawed at doors. The fire did more than heat frozen fingers. It gathered people together, created a circle of light where stories were told, where laughter sometimes slipped in despite hunger, where hope could be seen flickering in tired eyes. But coal was precious, and wood rarer still. When flames died low, families turned to candles. A single taper could transform a room, casting trembling halos that softened the harsh lines of poverty. In those fragile hours, candlelight worked. Its quiet magic children traced shapes in the shadows, turning them into knights, castles, and fantastical beasts. Parents whispered stories, their voices gentle, weaving lessons of resilience and faith into the glow. Even the scent of burning tallow or wax, mingled with damp wool and faint soup, carried a sense of security. It meant the night had been lit, that darkness had not won completely. People rationed every flicker, sometimes blowing out a flame before it burned halfway, saving it for another hour of need. Isn't it remarkable how something so small could carry so much weight? A sliver of fire meant meals, warmth, and survival. A trembling candle meant comfort, imagination, and the fragile beauty of hope. Together, hearth and candle gave London's poor not just light, but a reason to keep enduring one night and then the next, until winter's grip would finally loosen. When the city seemed to fall silent under frost, another sound rose above the stillness, the tolling of church bells. Their chimes carried through the frozen air, drifting over alleyways and markets, reaching the poorest tenements where families huddled close. Each note cut through the gray fog with a solemn grace, both mournful and comforting, reminding Londoners that time moved forward, even in the longest nights. Children often counted the bells, their small voices whispering numbers in rhythm with the echoes. Parents listened too, letting the sound sink deep, a reassurance that they were not forgotten, that beyond their darkened rooms there was structure, order, and a kind of divine watchfulness. For some, the bells marked hope that dawn would come, that charity kitchens would open, that another day had been endured. But these bells were not just markers of time, they carried memory and meaning. They reminded the faithful of prayers whispered in icy pews, of weddings celebrated long before the cold, of funerals attended with tears that froze on cheeks. In the winter of 1895, their resonance was amplified by hardship. Every chime seemed heavier, fuller, as if carrying the burdens of thousands. Even the fog itself seemed to cradle the sound, stretching it across rooftops and riverbanks. Sometimes, it felt as though the bells belonged to the whole city, binding rich and poor alike in the same rhythm. And isn't that the strange power of sound in silence? How it bridges distance, how it makes loneliness a little less sharp? For those who could not afford to enter the church, the bells were still theirs. They were free reminders of resilience, ringing out against the cold. A mother would pause, stirring her thin soup, just to listen. A father carrying firewood would stop mid-step, adjusting the bundle on his back, as if the sound itself gave strength. And children, half asleep under threadbare blankets, let the tolls lull them toward dreams, the chimes aligning with the soft beating of their hearts. The bells did not feed hungry mouths, nor mend worn boots, but in a city cloaked in frost and fog, they fed something else, the soul. And that nourishment, though unseen, was just as vital as bread or coal. The fog of London was no stranger to its people. But in the winter of 1895, it became almost a living presence. Thick, heavy, and damp, it clung to every brick wall, seeped into wool coats, and wrapped itself around the narrow streets like a shroud. The gas lamps flickered faintly, their halos swallowed by the mist until they looked like small moons hanging low above the cobblestones. For the poor, the fog was more than eerie beauty. It was danger. Imagine stepping outside to fetch water or coal, and the street you walked every day suddenly turned unfamiliar. Edges blurred, doors vanished into gray, and the sound of approaching footsteps could belong to a neighbor or to someone desperate enough to steal your bundle of wood. Parents held their children's hands tightly, guiding them carefully over icy stones, their breath mixing with the mist, until it seemed the air itself was alive. Yet there was something hauntingly beautiful in it too. The silhouettes of trees softened, rooftops dissolved into shadow, and the mighty Thames gleamed faintly like a ribbon of glass beneath the haze. For a brief moment, hardship felt veiled, as if the city's endless struggle was hidden behind a curtain of silver. Didn't it almost feel like London had stepped into another world? But the damp fog also carried weight. Clothes grew wetter, blankets stayed clammy, and fires had to fight harder to stay alive against the creeping moisture. It worsened coughs, deepened chills, and made even the strongest bones ache. Families layered rags over windows and stuffed cloth in door cracks, but the mist still found its way inside. Still, people adapted. Children played cautiously, their laughter muffled in the haze, while adults moved slowly, heads down, listening more than looking. Every gesture of kindness, a shared coal, a steadying hand, a lantern lifted high, mattered more when sight was stolen by fog. It was as if the city whispered a lesson. In the absence of clarity, you must trust one another. And so, London breathed in that gray air, day after day, balancing on the thin line between danger and wonder. The fog became part of survival, another challenge to endure, but also another reminder of the strange beauty that could live even in the bleakest winters. Even in the coldest corners of London's winter, children refused to surrender joy. Their world was narrow alleys, soot-dark courtyards, and frozen cobblestones. But somehow, they turned those harsh streets into playgrounds. Snow became their currency of fun. At first, their small fingers, stiff with cold, struggled to pack it into balls, but soon bursts of laughter echoed off the walls as they chased one another through the frost. Cobblestones slick with ice became racetracks. Boys slid across them with arms flailing, shouting as if they were champions on some grand field. A wooden crate or a battered tin pan could be transformed into a sled, carrying two children at once down the smallest slope, their shrieks piercing the heavy winter silence. Even scraps of broken wood, pulled together with rope, became imaginary forts where they waged battles of snow and grit. Parents, weary but tender, watched from windows or doorways. Some called warnings, "Mind your step," while others allowed the freedom, knowing that every giggle was a medicine no coal or bread could provide. Mothers pulled mittens over red fingers, adjusted scarves around ears, and fathers sometimes helped smooth a patch of ice so the sliding would be safer. The games themselves were lessons. Children learned balance, caution, and cooperation. They discovered how to share when one sled had to be passed among 10 eager hands, and how to care when a friend slipped and landed hard. Resilience was taught not in words, but in the act of standing up, brushing off snow, and running again. As twilight fell, the game slowed. Small figures trudged home, cheeks glowing crimson, noses dripping, mittens soaked. Yet their laughter lingered long after they disappeared behind doors. It drifted into the tenements, a reminder to parents huddled by fires that joy could survive hunger and frost. For those families, the sound of children's play was more than noise. It was proof that hope had not frozen. Isn't it remarkable how, even in a city drowning in fog and hunger, the simple laughter of children could warm an entire neighborhood? When midnight settled over London in the winter of 1895, the city seemed to hold its breath. The bustle of the day was gone. Market cries, cartwheels scraping across cobblestones, even the laughter of children had faded into silence. What remained was a world wrapped in frost and fog, transformed into something both haunting and strangely beautiful. Snow clung to the edges of alleys. Ice glazed the streets so that gas lamps, though dim, shimmered off the ground like tiny mirrors. The fog curled low and thick, muffling every sound, softening the harsh outlines of brick and chimney. Anyone who dared to walk at this hour moved like a shadow, swallowed quickly by the mist. But some had no choice. Coalmen still trudged under the weight of heavy sacks, shoulders stooped, faces streaked with soot and fatigue. Mothers, clutching their children's hands, hurried toward late-night charity halls, hoping for bread or broth. And occasionally, a doctor, scarf wrapped tightly, carried his kit down narrow lanes to tend to the sick who could not wait until morning. Every sound carried far in the hush. A single cough behind a shuttered window, the crunch of boots against ice, the faint tolling of a church bell drifting across the frozen Thames. It gave the midnight streets a strange intimacy, as though the entire city were listening together. The cold at that hour was merciless. It pressed through wool and leather, biting into fingers and stiffening breath until each exhale felt like shards of frost. Faces burned red, ears stung, and even the warmest hearts longed desperately for the glow of a fire. Yet, amid the severity, beauty revealed itself. Moonlight caught on frozen puddles, rooftops glittered like they were dusted with silver, and the great river itself shimmered, half ice, half mirror. For those who walked those streets, each step was an act of endurance. Yet with every coal sack delivered, every errand completed, and every child carried home through the fog, there was triumph. Returning to the dim glow of a hearth, to the layered blankets and the murmur of sleeping family, felt like victory over a night that seemed intent on swallowing everything. The midnight city of London was both enemy and companion, dangerous, icy, unforgiving, but also capable of moments of rare majesty. And for the poor who braved its streets, survival was not only necessity, it was a quiet statement of resilience, a promise that even through frost and silence, life would not be extinguished. If you asked a Londoner of 1895 what the most precious thing in their home was during that brutal winter, you would not hear answers about silver or furniture. You would hear only one word: fire. The hearth was more than bricks and soot, more than an iron grate and a scattering of glowing embers. It was the center of life itself, the fragile line between survival and surrender. In rooms where frost pressed against walls and fog crept under doors, the flicker of a small flame transformed misery into something bearable. It wasn't just warmth, it was safety, companionship, and proof that tomorrow might still be reached. Families huddled as close as space allowed. A mother sat with her children in a half circle, their knees touching, their faces lit in soft orange light that painted over hunger and fatigue for just a moment. A father leaned forward, poker in hand, gently prodding the coals to coax them into a steady burn. Sparks leapt, shadows danced across cracked plaster, and every eye followed the rhythm of fire as though hypnotized. Each ember mattered. Coal was expensive, wood scarce, and kindling often damp. So lighting and maintaining a fire was a skill passed carefully from parent to child. Children learned to cradle a coal, to shield it from drafts with their small bodies, to blow with patience until a faint glow swelled into a tiny flame. Even the youngest quickly understood that warmth could not be wasted. A single stick tossed too hastily into the grate could mean a colder morning, a harder night. The hearth was also the kitchen. Over those flickering flames, pots of broth simmered slowly, their scent filling narrow rooms with a comfort far richer than the thin meal itself. A potato roasted directly on coals was a delicacy, its skin blistered, its flesh steaming in fingers already numbed by frost. Bread toasted against an iron grate seemed like a feast. Families stretched what little they had, using the heat of their hearth to transform scraps into nourishment, thin into hearty, nothing into something. And still, the fire gave more than food. Around it, stories lived. Parents told tales of their own childhoods, of winters survived long before this one, of tricks learned and passed on. A grandmother might recall the frost fairs of earlier centuries, when the Thames had frozen solid and London had turned the river into a carnival. A father might tell of nights when his own father had carried coal on his back, miles through snow, just so the family could eat hot porridge. And children, eager for distraction, invented their own stories from the dancing shapes of flames, seeing castles, knights, or animals in every flicker. These moments were not grand. They were quiet, fragile, and fleeting, but they stitched families together with threads stronger than wool. Even when hunger gnawed and illness lingered, the act of gathering at the hearth reminded everyone that they were not alone, that love and togetherness could shield against cold as fiercely as blankets or bricks. Of course, the fire was also a reminder of danger. A stray spark could ignite threadbare curtains. A poorly vented chimney could choke a room with smoke. Many families balanced constantly between too much fire and too little, between safety and suffocation. Mothers slept lightly, ears attuned to the crackle of flames, ready to leap up and smother embers if they flared too high. Fathers checked chimneys for soot blockages, knowing that a clog could turn warmth into poison. Even children knew to fear the hiss of damp wood that smoked more than it burned. Still, fear did not outweigh gratitude. To sit by a fire was to feel human again. Outside, the world might be frozen gray, filled with hunger, frostbite, and silence, but inside the circle of light, laughter returned. Even brief laughter born from a joke, a misheard word, or a funny shadow on the wall seemed larger, brighter, magnified by the contrast of suffering and relief. For neighbors, the hearth was a gift to share. If one family had extra embers, they might carry a glowing coal across an icy courtyard to a home where the fire had died. Imagine that exchange. Mittened hands cupping a coal, the glow of life itself, walking it carefully through the night, so another family could have warmth. That act was more than charity. It was solidarity, a reminder that survival was collective, never solitary. The hearth was also a clock of sorts. Families measured their nights not by bells alone, but by how long embers lasted. A fire that survived until morning was a victory. One that died too soon was a cruel alarm, forcing parents from half-sleep to scramble for kindling in the dark, praying it would catch before children woke up shivering. Each night became a ritual of tending. Poke, fan, feed, protect, whisper. In those quiet hours, the fire was almost like another member of the household, fragile, demanding, but precious beyond measure. And there was beauty, undeniable, in those flames. Have you ever noticed how fire has its own language? The crackle, the hiss, the sudden pop of resin in a log. These sounds became music against the silence of the city outside. The glow softened faces, turned soot into shadowed contours, and reflected in tired eyes, with a sparkle of something that felt like hope. In rooms otherwise filled with damp and darkness, the fire painted warmth not only on walls, but on hearts. To imagine the hearth of 1895 is to understand how survival was never just about food or coal. It was about ritual, resilience, and connection. Every flicker of flame was a reminder that London's poor, though battered by frost and scarcity, still had within them the power to nurture, to protect, and to endure. Night after night, families clung to that fire, as though it were a promise. And in many ways, it was. A promise that morning would come, that children would sleep through the night without trembling, that soup would simmer again tomorrow, that life, however fragile, however battered, would not be extinguished. So yes, the hearth was bricks and embers, but it was also memory, love, tradition, and hope. It was the heart of the home. And in the winter of 1895, it was the quiet pulse of survival itself. If fire was the heart of survival in Victorian London, then kindness was its soul. The brutal frost of 1895 stripped everything down to essentials: food, fuel, shelter, but it also revealed the strength of bonds between people who had little more than scraps to their name. In those months, survival wasn't just about coal or bread. It was about what one person was willing to give another, even when their own cupboards were bare. Picture this: a narrow alley lined with leaning tenements, their windows fogged from breath and frost. A woman, shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, notices the family next door struggling to light a fire. She has barely enough coal herself, but she cups 2 glowing embers in a small tin, carries them across the snow-dusted courtyard, and sets them gently into her neighbor's hearth. That tiny gesture, a glow no larger than her palm, becomes the difference between another night endured or another night lost. These were the acts that kept London's poor alive, not grand charity banquets, but quiet exchanges in the shadows of frozen streets. A crust of bread slipped into a child's hand when no one was looking. A scarf draped around someone's neck after a day's labor. A bit of broth saved from a thin pot and delivered to an elderly neighbor, too frail to walk to the soup kitchen. And here's the remarkable thing: often the poorest were the most generous. A boy who sold newspapers in the markets might share a corner of his mittens with his younger sister. A mother who had gone without food for days might still offer half her portion of bread to the widow down the hall. Why? Because in a world where hunger was constant and the cold was merciless, the only wealth that mattered was shared humanity. The winter of 1895 was ruthless. Hunger hollowed cheeks, frostbitten fingers ached, and sickness lingered. But kindness, small, fleeting, sometimes almost invisible, was a warmth no draft could extinguish. Families remembered who had helped them when their coal ran out. Children remembered which neighbor had offered them a scrap of cheese when their stomachs were tight with emptiness. Those memories, those bonds, became just as essential as fuel or food. Sometimes kindness was practical. Neighbors would trade whatever scraps they had: a bundle of sticks for a slice of bread, a candle stub for a handful of coal, a pair of gloves patched with rags for a bowl of broth. These trades were not about profit. They were about balance, about making sure no household slipped too far into despair. In a way, it was a survival network, more reliable than any official system of relief. But sometimes kindness was purely selfless. A father returning from the markets might pass a child begging on the street corner, pale-faced and shivering. Instead of walking past, he would quietly press a small roll into the child's hand, whispering, "Share it with your sister." That child's smile, fleeting but real, was payment enough. Even children carried this instinct. Imagine a girl, no older than 10, pulling the mittens from her own hands and shoving them into the red, raw fingers of her best friend. She would return home empty-handed, her own hands burning with cold, but the bond between them was fire enough to keep her spirit warm. These were not lessons learned in school. They were born in hardship, carved into young hearts by necessity. And it wasn't only neighbors. Strangers too found ways to reach across the frost. Volunteers at soup kitchens didn't just ladle broth. They leaned down to smile at children, whispered encouragement to tired mothers, slipped an extra slice of bread into an empty pocket. those gestures lingered longer than the warmth of the soup itself. For many, they were proof that someone saw them, that their suffering was not invisible. You might ask, what difference could a single blanket, a single roll, a single ember really make? To a historian looking back, perhaps very little, but to a freezing family in 1895, it was everything. It meant their baby slept through the night without crying. It meant their father returned to work with a bit more strength in his arms. It meant hope survived one more day. And in the rhythm of that long winter, survival itself was made of days strung together by hope. The beauty of these small kindnesses was how they multiplied. One neighbor gave coal, another gave bread, another lent a blanket. Each gesture inspired another, until whole streets seemed to weave together in invisible threads of compassion. The poorest of London had discovered a truth that wealthier quarters often overlooked. Generosity grows even in scarcity. In fact, scarcity sharpens it. Think of it this way. A loaf of bread in a rich home was just food. But in the East End, in 1895, half a loaf shared among neighbors was a feast of humanity. A scarf passed to a stranger in the street was more than cloth. It was dignity, protection, and recognition that they mattered. In every shadowed alley, in every frost-covered courtyard, London's poor quietly built a city of kindness beneath the city of ice. Of course, not every story was tender. There were moments when desperation hardened hearts, when coal was stolen, when bread was fought over. But even in those moments, kindness often resurfaced. A thief who snatched a bundle of firewood might later leave half of it at the door of someone weaker than himself. Survival required harsh choices, but it also invited redemption. And so the winter of 1895 was not remembered only for its cruelty. It was remembered for the way humanity persisted in the cracks of that cruelty, like small flowers forcing themselves through stone. Acts of kindness did not melt the frost. They did not banish hunger, but they carried people through, day by day, ember by ember, crumb by crumb. When dawn broke over London's frozen rooftops, it wasn't just fire and food that had kept families alive. It was the knowledge that someone cared enough to share, to notice, to act. That warmth, though invisible, was as real as any coal flame. And perhaps, in the end, it was stronger. As we close this journey through the bitter frost of 1895 London, one truth becomes clear. Survival was never only about coal, bread, or blankets. It was about people, neighbors who shared what little they had, children who found laughter in the snow, mothers who sacrificed meals for their families, fathers who carried burdens heavier than their own strength, and strangers whose kindness reminded others they weren't forgotten. Yes, the winter was merciless. The fog was thick, the hunger sharp, the cold unrelenting. But inside the poorest tenements, by flickering hearths and candlelight, warmth still existed. Not always from the fire, sometimes from the soft squeeze of a hand, a whispered story, a shared smile. Those moments may have been small, but they were everything. Think about it. Frost can cover a city, but it cannot bury compassion. Hunger can hollow stomachs, but it cannot starve the human spirit. And even when the fog blurred streets and muffled sound, the faint toll of church bells and the laughter of children still carried proof that life, though fragile, endured. The people of 1895 did not endure because they were stronger than the frost. They endured because they were together. Every ember, every crumb, every shared gesture became a thread in a fragile but unbreakable net of survival. That is their legacy. Not just suffering, but resilience. Not just hardship, but hope. So tonight, as you drift into rest, let their story remind you, even in the coldest winters, literal or metaphorical, light can be found. Sometimes it's in a bowl of soup, sometimes in a kind word, sometimes in the simple act of holding on until morning. Thank you for walking these frozen streets with me, for listening to the whispers of London's past, and for carrying these stories forward. If you found meaning in this journey, I'd be so grateful if you left a like and subscribed. It helps keep these forgotten histories alive. And I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment and share a little piece of your own story. For now, may your night be warm, your dreams gentle, and your heart light. Sleep well, my friends. Good night.